Okay. All right. So I think most people know, but I'm going to go through a couple of introductory points so that people get an idea of what we're going to try to do. Basically, this is the first of projected, you could think of it as a semester-long class series. It's at, 12, 10, 11, 12 and a half, something that will attempt to cover the basics of LaRouche's, not just the economics, though we will have as the basic topic Lin's physical economy, but LaRouche's method, or his epistemology, his theory, his idea of the way the human mind works, number one. And number two, as they would say, I suppose, in a philosophy class, for LaRouche, epistemology is ontology. In other words, the way the mind works is what we are. That's what defines us as human, as opposed to whatever else we could be. And being in New York, we probably could have a number of ideas of what that might be. But the way we know things, the way we discover things, is the nature of our existence. So these are all wrapped in Lin's economics. And, I'll get to a sort of a starting point on that in a few minutes. Now, just to give you a quick idea, this is the first class, so we have a little flexibility. The way we hope to do this, first of all, is it will be based around this book, So You Wish to Learn All About Economics, which is sort of, I hate to call it a textbook, but it's a basic outline of Lin's economic outlook, which was printed or written in 1984, I believe. Now, it also exists, for those of you who only know Chinese, it exists in Chinese. For those of you who only know Russian, it exists in Russian, and a number of other languages. So if you don't understand me, you can get the book in a language that you understand. Now, the other thing that I'm going to use somewhat, I'll refer to today, is a report that was put out by LaRouche in 2004 entitled Economics, the End of a Delusion. Now, this has a lengthy section by Lin on his economics, and it also has, I think, a useful appendix on the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. Not only does it have an outline of what it was about the New Deal that was significant, and I'm going to refer to that a little bit today, but it also has a great deal of simple data as to what occurred in the New Deal. Now, following this week, I'm going to probably do another class next week if I don't get stopped. And then Jason Ross from the LaRouche research team, formerly known as The Basement, or maybe it's still known as The Basement, will be here for a couple of weeks. And he will be going, I think, into more detail on some of the material in the So You Wish to Know All About Economics. He himself wrote a paper or a pamphlet on physical chemistry, science and technology, and he'll be going over that. Now, at some point, so that the first four we have somewhat scheduled. Beyond that, there will be classes on music by choral director John Segerson. And I'll mention just a point on that. And then we hope to also have Helga LaRouche doing at least one session, maybe more, on Friedrich Schiller, probably focused on his aesthetic letters, the aesthetic education of man. So this is meant to be, and then we'll come back and we'll see where we stand. There's other members of the research team, probably Ben Deniston will go through the LaRouche's conception of an economic platform. Megan is, I've talked to her about doing something on Kepler and music. Also, she's done some updated work on the status of fusion energy research. So, those will be some of the topics. There may be other things. This may change in midstream, but you'll get the basic idea. I mean, the point of this is that, in effect, as you can't really get what we need today in the world without a conception, a deeper conception of what it is to be human, and therefore why we need the things that we need now. We're at a complete break point in human history. The fact of the matter is, and I'm not going to give a briefing, there was already a briefing earlier today, but the fact of the matter is the system that has run the world, the British monetarist system, which is what really the British Empire is. Boy, it's hard not to move around. What the British Empire really is dead. You're seeing this. This is the reality. This is the most significant thing about the Trump election. It's really not got a whole lot to do with Trump. The fact of the matter is we had reached a point where it's likely that anything would have beaten Hillary. I mean, Hillary represented almost self-consciously Wall Street, London, the utterly failed policies, confrontation with Russia, and in fact, people had reached the point in the United States, I think, where from whatever standpoint, good, bad, or indifferent, they weren't about to go off on another war, particularly a nuclear war, to satisfy the needs of Wall Street and London. You had the Brexit, so even the British citizens had said it's the end of the day. There's all kinds of things going on in Italy and Greece, et cetera, et cetera. You see it in another form, in something that's certainly very reminiscent of the 20s and 30s, which is these right-left gang, counter-gang, sometimes really spontaneous, but we have these situations where, extreme right-wing operations, extreme Antifa operations are being drawn out to have street fights and basically to create an environment of chaos and disaster. And I don't think it should be underestimated. It's true it hasn't reached the levels that we expect, a military putsch or a Nazi coup immediately. But if these things are not given the proper leadership, if the anger that people feel, if the fact that the system that they've lived by is dead, gone, it doesn't work. Money doesn't work anymore. If they're not given a certain quality of leadership, then you could end up in that direction. Now, the point is to try through this class and through a discussion of Lynn's development, the development of his ideas, the fact is, undeniably, that in terms of a comprehension of certainly the last 50 years of history, LaRouche has been right and everything else essentially wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that every date was right in that sense, but if you look at, in particular, the period from the middle 1960s to the present, where LaRouche has said, unless we change this system, unless we go back to minimally what Roosevelt did in the 30s and 40s, including what Roosevelt fought for in the Bretton Woods system, which was opposed by the British completely, which was opposed by I forget his name now anyway, the Keynes, directly against, Harry Dexter White at Bretton Woods. Unless we recognize that the death of that, what Nixon did to end that system in 1971, unless we replaced it with what FDR stood for and what Lynn stands for, the United States and much of the world probably would not survive. That's the point we're at, we've seen. Because actually, everything that Lynn has said has unfolded. For example, take the United States today. Except for the military strength of the United States, except for the nuclear arsenal, we are no longer a power. We've lost our manufacturing, but even more than that, we've lost our entire machine tool capability. We've lost our scientific capability in many respects. NASA has been taken down. There's no such thing as a real sense of science education. One good example of this is that in the 50s and 60s, after Sputnik and in the middle of the race to the moon, most people who went to college were going into the sciences, engineering. Today, most people, up till very recently, were going into what? Business administration, MBAs, finances, basically salesmanship, and how to, make money off of money. So what's happened? We no longer, look at the talk about infrastructure. It's a joke. It's ridiculous. What are we really talking about? We're talking about replacing 100-year-old water systems. We're talking about the fact that there's been, take the state of California, which brags about being the great bulwark against Trump. There has not been a single watt of electrical power added in California in 25 years, even though the population has grown by about 8 million. Why? Environmentalism. And indeed, one of the points that I hopefully will get across in the course of this series is environmentalism is a fraud, period. Unqualified. Now, I'm making that point, and this is a sort of a philosophical point, because the typical reaction is to say, well, yes, we shouldn't have all these environmental rules, and the businessmen don't like it because they want to make money. They want to make money off of coal. They want to make money off of oil. And that's why we, that's some of the opposition. But we do need clean water and we do need clean air and so on and so forth. Well, actually, that's wrong. The opposition to environmentalism, at least, should not be reduced to businessmen who are going to make money. If we have an anti-science, anti-development, anti-discovery approach, we will have more pollution than you can possibly imagine. That's the history of the human species. As a system runs down and is not replaced by a more advanced system, as you'll see, with greater degrees of energy flux density and more people, then that system and that population, as it decays, will produce more waste, more destruction than you would if you advanced the science, advanced the technology, and indeed found the ways to do away with the waste. For example, what's the most waste-free energy resource available to us today? Nuclear energy. And I'm even fission. It's the most, and yet, despite the fact that many Americans will say, yes, 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 you can't build a nuclear plant in the United States. That's the truth of the matter. And in fact, we're at -5 in the 21st century. When we began this century, we had 104 operating nuclear plants. We now have 99. So it's a little bit like 100 bottles of beer on the wall if one of those nuclear plants should happen to be shut down. And the fact of the matter is that there is not the slightest reason to avoid nuclear power, including Chernobyl. There are three things about Chernobyl, really. Number one, it was a lousy plant. In 1986, we weren't building plants like that. That was a graphite reactor, which was known to be, it was basically a weapons producing plant that was turned into a nuclear energy electricity resource. Graphite was the most dangerous form. It was early technology, number one. Number two, the Soviet system was collapsing. Number three, all that said, it wasn't that big a disaster. In fact, there's a lot of biodiversity around the Chernobyl plant. There were a lot of deaths partly because people went in to try to salvage the situation and were irradiated. But if you compare the losses at Chernobyl, which is the only major accident of its type, to the amount of people who died in coal mines or oil explorations, et cetera, or of course the amount of people who die for lack of electricity, you get an idea of how utterly and completely absurd it is. Now, one of the problems or Fukushima, these are the watchwords of the day. You have insanity in Germany. They're shutting down all of their nuclear plants. I'll give you a good example, just for those of you who like statistics, I suppose. You know, apparently in the last few days, the amount of available solar energy, supposedly, in the United States, for the first time, oh no, I think I have it backwards. The amount of wind energy in the United States, renewable energy resource, surpassed the amount of solar energy available. And also, I think hydro or whatever the story was. Anyway, now, what's a very interesting reality? What's the amount of solar energy available? What percentage of solar energy available on average at any given time of the so-called solar capacity? 32% or 35%. The same thing for wind energy. Because, you know, the wind doesn't always blow, despite Bob Dylan or whatever. So now what's the percentage of nuclear energy available at any given time? 93%. And so, in fact, after the initial investment, nuclear energy, let alone fusion, which I'm not going to talk about right now. Now, the point, Fukushima, what was it? It wasn't even a nuclear accident. It was a tsunami. It was an earthquake around 9, which is about as high as you're going to get. I mean, to give you an idea of what a 9, the Richter scale is a logarithmic scale. So you have to realize that 9 is not the number, it's the exponent. Now, I don't think it's orders of magnitude of 10, but it's a multiple times a multiple. Let's say take a typical strong earthquake like the Northridge earthquake that killed about 60 people in Los Angeles was a 6.9. Now, Fukushima was a 9. And Fukushima was also, the center of the earthquake was offshore. Now, that's classically the kind of earthquake that causes a tsunami. And you had a massive tsunami, and the reactors, which were built to withstand about an earthquake of 8 or 8.2, there was a chemical explosion. There was no nuclear explosion. There was not even a massive nuclear leak. Now, what happens to people, I think, is a point that I'll make on a number of occasions, but try to get, because it's one of these things that doesn't ever quite sink in, is that when you have a concept, a change in outlook, a change in theory, it changes everything. Every conception that falls under it changes in its nature. So, for example, when you go from Euclidean geometry to truly non-Euclidean geometry, that is to say, you don't just change an axiom, and we'll discuss some of these things in more detail, but the typical way in which it's presented is they realized at a certain point that the parallel so-called postulate, if you have a line and a point off that line, there's one and only one parallel line through it. This somewhat befuddled people because it referred to an infinite extension. As far as you extended the line, they would never meet. And so people thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could get rid of that axiom because it refers to the infinite? And you never know. The infinite is sort of hard to think about. And so they tried to prove the axiom from the other axioms, and they failed. Now, so at a certain point, some people, really Gauss, but publicly more renowned are a couple of people named Bolyai and Lobachevsky. And they said, well, let's consider changing the parallel postulate. What happens if we say that there are no parallel lines, or there are many parallel lines? You get different geometries. If you say that there's no parallel lines, you get a spherical, you get the surface of a sphere. If you say that there are a lot of parallel lines, you get something that's kind of what they call monkey saddle. It moves in different directions. It stretches. It's sort of like stretching saran wrap. And the lines never meet. But the problem was that what did they do? They took this as another axiom and they left everything else the same. What did Gauss and Riemann do? They said there's something wrong with Euclidean geometry. The fact of the matter is, when you change an axiom, you change the meaning of everything in the system. Everything. And they said what we need is not a non-Euclidean, not a different axiom, which they referred to as neo-Euclidean, but we need a truly non-Euclidean geometry, a geometry that comes from the actual construction of physical objects in the physical universe. And this is what led to a whole change in outlook on the relationship between physics and geometry. Ultimately, this is what Einstein used in general relativity. This what, in fact, the breakthrough for Einstein was moving from a relatively linear conception of geometry to a Riemannian conception of geometry. Now, in any system, if you change any fundamental aspect of that system, if you change any fundamental axiom, you change everything. You change what a straight line is, you change what a point is, you change what a triangle is, you change how you move in that system, and so on and so forth. And I think this is part of the point of the discussion, and is that, for example, take Glass-Steagall. in organizing for Glass-Steagall. Now, that doesn't mean you don't organize for the policy, but in the organizing, when you're organizing, you have to realize that Glass-Steagall doesn't work in the Wall Street London system. It means you have to change all the rules. It's not just the that's why it was such a crucial law in the reorganization of the banking system. Nothing that Roosevelt did would have worked over any extended period of time if he had not said, we're going with Glass-Steagall. What did Glass-Steagall mean? It meant you separated speculative parts of the financial system from the actual physical economy, from what we call the real economy. Think about the words. There's the real economy and there's the speculative economy. That's really probably wrong conceptually. There's the real economy and then there's junk. And if there's something that's parasitic, and the whole conception of money that most people have is parasitic. For example, you take the stock market. Most people think that view their retirement, and they say, well, you know, some of my retirement is in stocks. So if we take down the speculative economy, we take down the stock market, then I lose money. Now, why? Because they believe that the stock market and money represent something. Now, here's a good way to look at it. The stock market is now at 20,000 plus, I believe. Now, all right, now think about the following. The stock market was at 14,000 when the crisis of 2007, 2008 hit. And I believe it went down below 7,000 or around 7,000. Then a couple of years ago, it made it back up to 14,000. Now, how many people think that there was a 100% improvement in the economy in the Obama administration? And in fact, you know, other than Obama. And now, since it hit 14,000, it's now at 20,000. That occurred in about 2 years. Now, how many people think there was a 43% increase in the economy in the last 2 years? In other words, the stock market is purely speculative. It doesn't represent anything. In fact, what it largely represents is companies, instead of issuing dividends, buy back their stock. And by buying back their stock, they increase the value of the stock because people are buying it on the stock market, or i.e. they're buying it on the stock market. And that supposedly represents an increase in the wealth of the stockholders as opposed to a dividend. Now, what's really going on? The people who speculate in the stock market are making killings, and they're making killings whether it goes up or down because they short the market or they buy into the market. And the people who are holding on to the stock, thinking that's their retirement, are not only are they going to be stuck, they realize if they don't get stuck with the crash, they're going to find that cashing that stock in doesn't buy anything. We have a secular rate of inflation in basic costs. That means, for example, you can't live in the United States if as a senior citizen if you have to pay, you know, for gap insurance, and if you still have a car and so on and so forth, you need $25,000, $30,000 a year to live. Nobody gets that in Social Security. So what's going to happen? Your stocks are not worth anything. Plus, the system is about to blow out because it's a speculative bubble. So people are going to lose their retirement funds just the way they did in 2007, 2008, because they don't have enough money to wait 8, 9 years for the value of the stock to go back up.